Michael I. Handel, Masters of War, Classic Strategic Thought, third revised and expanded edition. This is from Chapter 8, Clausewitz on the Role of Moral Forces in War. It is even more ridiculous when we consider that these very critics usually exclude all moral qualities from strategic theory and only examine material factors. They reduce everything to a few mathematical formulas of equilibrium and superiority, of time and space limited by a few angles and lines. If that were really all, it would hardly provide a scientific problem for a schoolboy. Clausewitz on War. And moral elements are among the most important in war. Unfortunately, they will not yield academic wisdom. They cannot be classified or counted. They have to be seen or felt. It has often been argued that Clausewitz emphasizes the need to view war as a rational instrument, as a means for the leaders to promote and protect their state's vital interests. From this accurate interpretation, however, some readers have then erroneously inferred that Clausewitz also considers it possible for war itself to be waged as a rational activity. In fact, Clausewitz repeatedly reminds us that this is not so, for he knows that war, in all its dimensions, is permeated by non-rational influences, or what he calls moral factors, moralische Größen, spiritual forces, geistigen Kräften, or spiritual factors, geistigen Größen, which cannot be classified or counted. For Clausewitz, these intangible, non-quantifiable, moral factors, not to be confused with morale, which is only one type of moral factor, are so intertwined with activity on all levels of war that we cannot even identify all of their complex interactions with each other and with the material elements. Some of these countless moral factors include, for example, the personality, creativity, experience, and intuition of leaders, the passions and character of the people, the training and motivation of the military, the quality of the military doctrine, and the behavior of the troops under fire and their continued resistance following a defeat. In addition to the moral factors, neutral factors such as friction, chance, uncertainty, the probabilistic nature of war, luck, poor intelligence, and above all the unpredictable nature of war combine to undermine the possibility of waging war as a purely rational activity. Indeed, many of these moral factors are already mentioned in discussions throughout this book, but a special chapter such as this is useful to further emphasize their importance in Clausewitz's theory of war. Remembering the role of moral factors in war in today's wartime environment is critical for two reasons. First, most modern military organizations are so preoccupied with the material and technological aspects of war that they tend to overlook its moral dimensions. The Vietnam War, the Gulf War, and more recently the war against Serbia and the Russian war in Chechnya are recent examples of this mindset. Second, many military experts who have developed the current theories of information war, cyber war, and the revolution in military affairs, or RMA, often imply or suggest that war has been transformed into a rational activity that can be based on perfect or near perfect information. In this case, they claim, the precise execution of carefully laid war plans combined with thorough preparations and use of state-of-the-art technology will make the outcome of war highly predictable. But to paraphrase Clausewitz, recent events have scattered such nonsense to the winds. There is, however, nothing new about the well-meaning but misguided desire to identify laws or principles of war that would eliminate the discomfiting uncertainties of warfare. Efforts, Clausewitz said, were made to equip the conduct of war with principles, rules, or even systems. They did present a positive goal, but people failed to take adequate account of the endless complexities involved. The conduct of war branches out in almost all directions and has no definite limits, while any scientific system, any model has the finite nature of a synthesis. While this quest was in the past based on an attempt to distill scientific principles of war from past experience, today it springs from overconfidence in the panacea of a superior technology. One can see why access to better real-time communications, improved command and control, the collection of more intelligence on a greater number of targets, and the increased range and precision of weapons delivery might seem enough to dispel many of the uncertainties of the past. Today, as much as in Clausewitz's time, there are still those who think that new and better theories of war can minimize the costs of waging war to the point where fighting and bloodshed will become unnecessary. This reflects a lack of realism bolstered by wishful thinking. If anything, the role of moral factors has actually expanded in modern warfare. For example, the influence of real-time mass media on public opinion. Moreover, war is and will remain a relentlessly reciprocal activity in which all participants can counter each other with different methods, weapons, and technologies. Thus, the arguments that Clausewitz makes against the scientific military theories and predictable wars of Bulov or Yomini remain relevant today. Objecting vehemently to such attempts to reduce war to a science, Clausewitz views such theories as intellectually repugnant. Quote, they aim at fixed values, that is, they do not understand the reciprocal and dynamic nature of war, but in war everything is uncertain and calculations have to be made with variable quantities. They direct the inquiry exclusively toward physical quantities, that is, tanks, brigades, refineries, communication centers, whereas all military action is intertwined with psychological forces and effects, that is, moral factors. They consider unilateral action, whereas war consists of continuous interaction of opposites. Clausewitz on war. Instead of acknowledging the difficulties posed by the realities of war, such theorists artificially reduce its complexities to fit their theories or political organizational agendas. This type of expediency is still widely practiced today. Quote, they, the theorists, soon found out how difficult the subject was and felt justified in evading the problem by again directing their principles and systems only to physical matters and unilateral activity. That is the emphasis on technology in many of today's theories of war. As in the science concerning the preparations for war, they wanted to reach a set of sure and positive conclusions and for that reason considered only factors that could be mathematically calculated. Clausewitz on war. A realistic theory of war cannot, however, be constructed on the basis of only a few selective, quantifiable variables. It must take into account the moral as much as the material factors of war. Military activity is never directed against material force alone. It is always aimed simultaneously at the moral forces which give it life, and the two cannot be separated. Elsewhere, he states, quote, the effects of physical and psychological factors form an organic whole, which unlike a metal alloy is inseparable. In formulating any rule concerning physical factors, the theorist must bear in mind the part that moral factors may play in it. Most matters in this book, referring to On War, are composed of equal parts of physical and moral causes and effects. One might say that the physical factors seem little more than the wooden hilt, while the moral factors are the precious metal, the real weapon, the finely honed blade, or more accurately, the sharpened blade. Thus Clausewitz argues that the moral, intangible factors are in fact more important than the material factors. From the very first sentence of On War, Clausewitz makes it clear that one cannot separate the various material and intangible factors in war. War can only be studied as a whole, as a gestalt. In war, he says, more so than in any other subject, we must begin by looking at the whole, for here, more than elsewhere, the part and the whole must always be thought of together. He clarifies this point in section 5, where he states that the military strength of any state is the product of two inseparable factors: the whole, material means at his disposal, and the strength of his will, the moral factors. While the means can be quantified in most cases, the strength of the will is much less easy to determine and can only be gauged approximately. The inability to quantify the relative strength of moral factors explains why most modern analysts prefer to focus on measuring capabilities related to technology and firepower, while some theorists primarily confine themselves to the theory of rational analysis. Conveniently ignoring the moral intangibles, such as motivation or intentions, they search for success not where the problems exist, but only where the data can be identified and quantified. Unfortunately, moral factors will not yield to academic wisdom. They cannot be classified or counted. They have to be seen or felt. The estimation of moral factors must often be left to the intuition or experience of the military commander, or in today's world, the military analyst. This is why, quote, principles and opinions in war can seldom reduce the path of reason to a simple line. That is, war is not amenable to a linear type of analysis. As in all practical matters, a certain latitude always remains. The man of action must at times trust in the sensitive instinct of judgment, which almost unconsciously hits on the right course. Thus, the complex interactions in war can only be divined by the intuition of the military genius. As with many of Clausewitz's most original concepts, his discussion of the role of moral factors in war is mainly concerned with the operational level of war, that is, the effect of intangible psychological factors on the outcome of a battle, and the difficulty of predicting their nonlinear influence on the behavior of soldiers following an unexpected outcome. Moral factors also play an important part on the higher strategic level of determining, for example, the support of the people for a government under duress, and the readiness of the people to go on fighting a people's war after a defeat. Furthermore, if we view moral factors as representing all intangible dimensions affecting the course of a war, we should include the ability of creative political and military leaders to devise an original strategy. Nevertheless, a careful reading of On War makes it clear that most of Clausewitz's discussion of the role of moral factors pertains to the lower operational and tactical levels. Quote, loss of moral equilibrium must not be underestimated merely because it has no absolute value and does not always show up in the final balance. It can attain such massive proportions that it overpowers everything by its irresistible force. For this reason, it may in itself become a main objective of the action. End quote. Moral factors therefore constitute one of the most important operational objectives in war. A successful attack on the enemy's moral equilibrium in battle is a powerful force multiplier that cannot be understood in linear or quantitative terms. Quote, the psychological effect of victory, or achieving surprise or the enemy's loss of a key military leader, does not merely grow in proportion to the amount of military forces involved, but does so at an accelerating rate. Nowhere does Clausewitz summarize this problem more cogently than at the end of the chapter on the culminating point of victory. How can the general identify the culminating point of victory? How can he assess the morale of his enemy? He must guess, so to speak, guess whether the first shock of battle will steel the enemy's resolve and stiffen his resistance, or whether, like a Bologna flask, it will shatter as soon as its surface is scratched. Guess the extent of debilitation and paralysis that the drying up of particular sources of supply and the severing of certain lines of communication will cause the enemy. Guess whether the burning pain of the injury he has been dealt will make the enemy collapse, or like a wounded bull arouse his rage. Guess whether the other powers will be frightened or indignant, and whether and which political alliances will be dissolved or formed. When we realize that he must hit upon all this and much more by means of his discreet judgment, as a marksman hits a target, we must admit that such an accomplishment of the human mind is no small achievement. Thousands of wrong turns running in all directions tempt his perceptions, and if the range, confusion, and complexity of the issues are not enough to overwhelm him, the dangers and responsibilities may. Although the number of possible permutations is much smaller on the strategic than the operational level, Clausewitz's observations apply to both. Furthermore, despite the availability of real-time information and communications, satellite photography, and SIGINT, the moral factors that need to be addressed and the judgments that must be made are not necessarily any easier now than in the 19th century. Did the President of the United States and his advisors correctly identify the culminating point of victory at the end of the Gulf War? Did he accurately assess the moral factors involved? Whether he did or not remains open to debate, but all of the modern technology at his disposal certainly could not help him make a better decision. Similarly, the expectations of top U.S. decision-makers in March 1999 that a few days of bombing would cause Slobodan Milosevic's government to shatter like a Bologna flask proved to be embarrassingly wrong. Despite NATO's high-tech weaponry and near-perfect intelligence on Yugoslavian material capabilities, NATO grossly misjudged Yugoslav intentions and the strength of the moral factors involved. The result was a prolonged and only partially effective air campaign that might have damaged the Kosovar Albanians and NATO as much as it did Serbia. An earlier example of a monumental strategic error that resulted from ignoring the role of moral, intangible factors in war was Hitler's expectation that a corrupt and decadent Soviet Union would capitulate soon after the beginning of a Nazi invasion in June 1941. When Hitler hubristically compared his imminent attack on Russia to kicking a rotting door, he seriously underestimated Russia's power of resistance. Stalin's political and organizational capabilities, and the Soviet reaction to Nazi brutalities. Conversely, Hitler's overall strategy in the Second World War is an outstanding example of how the value of moral factors can be mistakenly exaggerated at the expense of material economic imperatives. Hitler's intoxication with his own early successes in the war convinced him that Germany's moral superiority, its superior military doctrine, the Blitzkrieg, German racial superiority, and his inspired leadership would crush any imaginable resistance. As a result, he did not hesitate to begin a war on two fronts, that is, to attack the Soviet Union before finishing the war in the West, and to declare war on the United States. Believing vainly in the triumph of the will, Hitler was defeated by superior material and economic strength, superior intelligence, and the determination of his inferior opponents. As much as Clausewitz emphasizes the role of moral factors in war, he can do no more than apprise us of their critical importance, but cannot otherwise supply any concrete guidance on how to identify or measure them. This type of knowledge cannot be forcibly produced by an apparatus of scientific formulas and mechanics. It can only be gained through a talent for judgment and by the application of accurate judgment, i.e. experience, to the observation of man and matter. The appreciation and understanding of moral factors can only be perceived by the inner eye, which differs in each person and is often different in the same person at different times. Therefore, although a good theory of war can never ignore moral factors, it cannot provide a fully satisfactory account of them either. That would be impractical and futile. Ultimately, Clausewitz argues, no theorist and no commander should bother himself with psychological and philosophical sophistries. Any attempt to classify or list the moral factors that influence war in detail can all too easily lead to platitudes, while the genuine spirit of inquiry soon evaporates and unwittingly we find ourselves proclaiming what everyone already knows. Therefore, Clausewitz makes it clear that he can treat the subject of moral factors only in an incomplete and impressionistic manner, content to have pointed out their general importance. This fits perfectly with his observations on the value, but also the limits of any theory of war. In closing his discussion on the role of moral factors, Clausewitz, to his credit, does not try artificially to impose a comprehensive and rigorous theory on the role of moral forces in war, much as he was probably tempted to do so. Figure 8.1, limits to the rational conduct of war. War should be conducted as rationally as possible. Clear objectives, cost-benefit calculations, correlation of ends and means, economy of force. Next box, friction, chance, poor intelligence, passions and hate, political goals are irrational, limits to the rational conduct of war.